Amy, Amy. I morning. How are you? Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hearing you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry, the other time I was unable to join in, I was unwell. And today I want us to look at the next topic, which focuses on nation and a nation state.
What?
But I think we had discussed about nation and a nation state. Let us focus on European colonies in Africa. We are focused more on nation and nation state. And let us look at European colonies in Africa. In Africa, we have experienced various epochs, the pre-colonial and colonial period. Now, the colonial period in Africa, it involved the coming of Europeans that is in Africa, the coming of Europeans in Africa, and we have some of the factors that led to the coming of Europeans in Africa. Factors that led to the coming of European in Africa. Factors that led to the coming of European in Africa. Just give me a minute. Factors that led to the coming of European in Africa. So we have some factors that led to the coming of European in Africa. There was economic factors, political factors, and there were political factors, social factors, and economic factors. For example, some of the Europeans came to Africa more specifically to acquire raw materials. In terms of economics, we have certain Europeans who came to Africa firstly to acquire raw materials from Africa and also to find new markets for their goods. That is one of the factors in relation to economic. They came to Africa to acquire raw materials for their industry, and also they needed a place where they could Number two, under economic, I've also mentioned new market for their goods. New market for their goods. Market for their goods. I'm still admitting people. Kindly pardon me. I'm still admitting. Kindly mute. Kindly mute. I'm still admitting people. I'm still admitting people. So the first topic that we are coming in, we are learning about factors in Africa, and we are assessing some of the factors that led to the coming of Europeans in Africa. The first one that we have mentioned is the economic factor, that is raw material, whereby the Europeans wanted to explore resources from Africa, resources such as minerals for their industries and EPT. Number two is that the European also wanted to find a new market for their goods, new market for their goods, especially the goods that they had processed in their factories in Europe. Another important aspect why the European came to Africa is that they came because of social aspects, such as prestige. They wanted to be seen as also very influential, and it was very prestigious for them to colonize Africa because they were acquiring Africa was also a form of acquiring territories. So basically, them colonizing Africa, it was very prestigious for them, and they felt that they have achieved a lot. Number two, number two, mute, mute. Kindly mute, class. Kindly mute. You are unmuted. Kindly mute. So, sorry, maybe we can go on. Before we go into social, I think I've mentioned a social aspect whereby they came to Africa because of prestigious purposes and also the pride. Apart from that, I'll just mix both social, economic, and political so that you can go fast. We also have another factor is that they came to Africa. They came to Africa. They came to Africa. They came to Africa because they wanted to acquire territories, and when they acquired territory, it was a form of expansion. When they acquired territories, it was a form of expansion. Expand their territories and also expand their empire. Another reason why they came to Africa is that establishing colonies in Africa also allowed Europeans or European nation to control key strategic locations such as major ship routes and also mineral resources. So also they came to Africa so that they could establish a major strategic location such as major shipping routes and also mineral resources. Another reason why they came to Africa was because of nationalism, rise of nationalism, nationalism in Europe. This encouraged the expansion of European empires as colonial control. We talk of nationalism. Yes. Sorry for that. Now, a sense of nationalism. It was a sense of nationalism and empire building. Okay, thank you, King. I'll mute them.
Participants left.
Now, the rise of nationalism in Europe also encouraged the expansion of European empires in Africa. I hope you have noted that the economic aspect, the social aspect, and also political aspect. What are the other factors that led to the coming of European? Anyone? Other factors? Other factors? Well, now I don't know.
Not clear. They are not getting.
Just to remove you. Yes, other factors that you might mention. Other factors.
Trade.
How was it trade? Maybe you can elaborate further. How was it? So we can talk of trade routes and new markets. Europeans sought to control key trade routes to secure access to profitable goods. The Europeans sought to control key trade routes so that they could secure access to profitable goods. They wanted to control key trade routes, whereby they could acquire raw materials from Africa, such as sugar, then it is taken to their countries for manufacturing purposes. Then the goods are brought back to African continent. Another factor that led to the coming of European. Number two, there was national rivalries and competition. There was national rivalries and competitions. This is whereby European powers such as Spain, France, Britain, and Portugal, they competed over global dominance. So for them to colonize Africa, it was an achievement because of the national rivalries, competitions between countries such as Spain, Britain, and also France. Another important thing that you need also to note that apart from rivalry and competition over acquisition of colonies or colonies in Africa, another reason why they came to Africa is the belief of civilizing mission or civilization mission. The belief of civilization mission. These Europeans came to Africa believing that they had a burden. It was a white man's burden to civilize Africans, Africans who were backward, Africans who were primitive, because the Europeans saw themselves more superior, more specifically their civilization was more superior, their culture was more superior. So they had this burden of coming to Africa so that they can civilize Africans who are primitive. And another reason why they came to Africa is because of they believe that their race was more superior than ours. This assumption of their race being superior than ours is known as social Darwinism theory, whereby they believed that European race is more superior than the African race. Another reason why they came to Africa is that they had already developed important, you can say, transportation vessels like the ships and also mapping technologies. This enabled the European explorers to come also to Africa and also colonizers. Good. Up to there, I hope we are together. So very quickly, I want us to look at what are the impacts, the impact of colonization. The impact of colonization in Africa. The impact of colonization. One, we have the political impact. The political impact, whereby there was establishment of new. The first political impact is that colonialism led to establishment of new boundaries, new borders, and these new borders that were established by the colonial power ignored. These new borders ignored the importance of ethnicity, the importance of linguistics, composition, and also cultural division. So another one of the most important impacts of colonialism is that it led to establishment of new boundaries. New boundaries it really impacted the communities negatively because these new boundaries ignored important aspects such as ethnic, linguistic, and cultural divisions. Number two is this colonization led to loss of sovereignty. Colonization led to loss of sovereignty, whereby African nations lost their political sovereignty under colonial rule. Africans were not independent anymore. They were dependent on European powers. So you need to know that political impact is that it led to loss of sovereignty, whereby African countries were no longer independent. They relied more on European. Europeans were the ones who made decisions. Colonial masters were the ones who made decisions regarding their land, regarding their resources, and also their future. Another impact of colonialism led to introduction of Western political system. It led to introduction of Western colonial system. Introduction of Western colonial system, meaning previously our African communities, our African states were having their own kind of social, political, and economic organization, and more specifically political organization. During the pre-colonial period, we had our own kind of political organization, which was based on centralized and decentralized. However, with the introduction of colonialism, it led to also introduction of new political system in Africa, which was a borrowed model from European model. Sorry. Another important impact is that colonialism led to maybe exploitation of natural resources of African continent. The resources of African continent were exploited. Resources such as mineral, agriculture, and also labor. Colonialism also affected the diversification of agricultural activities. It also affected the diversification of agricultural activities in Africa, whereby most of the crops that were grown by African people, yams, cassava, were overlooked, and instead, the colonial master emphasized the growing of cash crops such as cocoa, coffee, and cotton. This really affected the agricultural diversity of African countries. Another important impact is that this colonialism led to disruption of social structures, whereby this colonization disrupted traditional African societies and their social structures. For example, before the coming of the colonial masters, local communities were often adapted to their traditional values, traditional customs, and also morals. However, with the coming of Europeans, the coming of colonizers, it disrupted the African traditional societies. The colonial masters also supported the introduction of Western education and also Christianity. In fact, they emphasized the adoption of formal system of education and also a new kind of religion, which was specifically Christianity. So one of the most important impact in terms of social impact is the introduction of Western education, because this Western education played an important role among the African elites. Colonizers introduced Western education and also Christianity, which changed the African culture, which eroded the African traditional religion, which eroded the informal education that was being practiced by the pre-colonial society. So I want us to look at factors that led to decolonization. Factors that led to the decolonization. Number one, number one factor that led to the decolonization of African countries is that after the World War II, the European powers were weakened. European powers such as Britain, France, and Belgium, they were weakened. And these European powers were like Britain, France, and Belgium. More specifically, the financial cost of the war affected the European powers, because they needed this money to control their territories in Africa. But now with the World War II, it led to financial challenges, financial incapacitation, whereby they were unable to utilize the money in the territories in Africa. This contributed to decolonization of Africa. Number two, changing attitude in Europe.
Pardon, number one.
Oh, number one. Huh?
Yes.
Number one, I've talked of devastation of World War II, devastation of World War II, devastation of World War II. This weakened European colonial powers like Britain, France, and Belgium. And it weakened them in terms of financial costs of the war, which affected their economy. And therefore, they were unable to support financially the territories in Africa. Then number two, changing attitude in Europe, especially with the principle of democracy, liberty, and equality. Especially with the principle of democracy, liberty, and equality. This promoted now independence. Okay, should I go back?
Yes.
I was talking about factors that led to decolonization. Number one, I've talked of devastation of World War II. Some people are complaining, that's why I'm going back. Devastation of World War II. This World War II weakened European powers because these Europeans were involved in this one, World War II. So it weakened their powers, it weakened their financial cost, their finances, and these are European powers such as Britain, France, and Belgium. Having been weakened economically and financially, it also affected the way they ruled and the way they controlled Africa because their finances were constrained. So they were even unable to rule Africa. Number two is their territory, not territory, sorry. Number two is their attitude. The attitude. Number two, it is the attitude. Number two is the attitude, whereby this attitude came with the principle of democracy, liberty, and equality. Therefore, it was necessary to end colonialism. This attitude came with the principle of democracy, liberty, and equality. Therefore, it was necessary for them to ensure that Africans were independent and they had liberty to make their own decisions. Another point is that decolonization. Another point that led to decolonization is that in the 20th century, African leaders and intellectuals began to organize and advocate for political rights. In the 20th century, African leaders and intellectuals began to organize for political rights and civil liberties. In the 20th century, African leaders and intellectuals began to advocate for political rights and also civil liberties and independence. In the 20th century, we could see the African leaders, intellectuals coming in, enlightening people about the importance of political rights, civil liberties, and independence. Number two, many African leaders who had been educated in European institutions began to have a greater participation in governance and later on in independence movement. Most of the African leaders who were educated in European institutions outside Africa, they began to have greater participation in governance and eventually independence. So this is another point. African leaders, educated leaders, you can say the elites or educated leaders from European institutions began to demand greater participation in governance and eventually independence.
Rudia hiyo nini point tena.
Educated elite. educated elites, and most of these educated elites acquired the education from the Western world, European institutions, and they began to have or they began to participate in governance system. They began to participate in governance system, and subsequently, they also participated in independent movements. Another important point is Pan-Africanism. 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 The purpose of Pan-Africanism was to unite all the people of African descent. Pan-Africanism, and the purpose of Pan-Africanism was to unite all the people of African descent so that they could deal with the challenges that affect them. So that they could deal with the challenges that affect them, challenges such as colonialism, challenges such as racism. So Pan-Africanism contributed in bringing the people of African descent together so that they can deal with challenges that affect them. And these challenges are like colonialism, poverty, and racism. Another point is the formation of United Nations. After formation of UN in 1945, this formation of UN in 1945 became an important platform for decolonization. The formation of UN became an important platform for decolonization because the UN Assembly called for end of colonialism, because the UN Assembly called for the end of colonialism. So the formation of UN in 1945 became an important platform for decolonization process. And therefore, the UN played an important role in supporting the anti-colonial movement. Another point on decolonization is that colonial powers found it increasingly difficult to suppress resistance movements in the African territories. Colonial powers found it increasingly difficult to suppress resistance movements in African territories. Colonial powers found it increasingly difficult to suppress resistant movements in their African territories. These movements were such as Mau Mau in Kenya, the National Liberation Front in Nigeria. These movements were such as the Mau Mau in Kenya, National Liberation Front in Algeria. So the point here is that colonial powers found it increasingly difficult to suppress resistant movements in their African territories. For example, we have Mau Mau in Kenya, number 2, National Liberation Front in Algeria. Another important point is that after the World War II, African soldiers who had fought for colonial powers had a great sense of nationalism. They returned home with a great sense of nationalism. African soldiers who had fought for colonial powers during World War II, they returned home with great sense of nationalism and also expectations for political change. After the World War II, soldiers who returned home, they had a great sense of nationalism and expectations for political change in Africa. Another point is that African leaders were inspired also by other struggles. African leaders were inspired by other global struggles for independence. African leaders were inspired by other global struggles for independence, such as India's successful campaigns, against the British, and they gained independence in 1947. African leaders were also inspired by other global struggles. For instance, or for example, we have India, which attained independence in 1947. So up to there, I think we are together. Elizabeth, mute your mic. Mute, or I will just remove you. So up to there, I hope we are together. So today we are focused on some of the important aspects of colonialism. We have looked at factors that led to the coming of colonialism, and we have mentioned that these factors are normally divided into political, social, and economic. But I've just decided to look at it generally. And first of all, we looked at one of the main factors that led to the coming of Europeans in Africa was because they wanted to provide raw material. They wanted to acquire raw materials from Africa for their industries. Number two, they also wanted a market for their finished products, and therefore they came to Africa to colonize Africa so that Africa can form a market for their finished products. Another important aspect is that they also came to trade. I think that falls under the new market, came to trade. Number two is because there was rivalries among Europeans. There were rivalries among Europeans in terms of acquiring more territories in Africa. So basically, most of them came to Africa to show that they are also powerful enough to acquire territories in Africa. Another point is that they came to Africa because they believed, I'm doing a recap, they believed that they wanted to acquire, they wanted to civilize, not to acquire, but to civilize Africans, because they believed Africans were uncivilized. Another point is that they came to Africa because they wanted to expand their territory. Another important point is that they came to Africa because they also believed that their race was more superior than that of African. They also came to Africa to introduce their religion and also education. We've also looked at the impact where we are seeing that some of the impacts of colonialism ranges from social, political, and economic, whereby we talked of the borders were affected because they established new borders. And one impact is that they established new borders, and these borders ignored ethnic, linguistics, and cultural division. Another point is that Africans lost their political sovereignty because of colonialism. Africans lost their political sovereignty because of colonialism. Now, another point is that I'm just doing a recap. Colonialism led to introduction of new kind of political system in Africa, and this new kind of political system was borrowed from European model. Another important point is that the European powers exploited our natural resources. Another impact is that the European powers exploited our natural resources, such as minerals, agricultural products, and labor. Another point is that these colonial masters also affected the diversification of agricultural products in Africa. This is because the colonial masters only emphasized on cash crops, coffee, and cotton to an expense of other products. Therefore, the Europeans, that is, or the colonial masters, affected agricultural diversification of Africa. Colonial masters affected the agricultural diversification of Africa because they only focused on cash crops such as coffee, cocoa, and cotton, ignoring the traditional agricultural products such as yams and cassava. Another impact of colonialism is that colonialism disrupted traditional African societies. Colonialism disrupted African traditional societies, whereby before the coming of Europeans, in the pre-colonial period, Africans were practicing laws, they were having their own customs and values, which were disrupted, which were affected by the colonialism or colonization process. Another impact is that colonizers introduced Western education, which was a formal education, and they also introduced Christianity, which led to significant changes in African culture. Up to there, I hope you are good. Those are the impacts of colonialism. So let us focus on factors that led to decolonization. I'm just doing a recap. One, after World War II, the power has gone off, but we can go on. Factors that led to decolonization. After World War II, European colonial masters were devastated in terms of finances, and their economies were devastated. This also affected their rule, the way they control their territories in Africa, and also it affected their finances because they required that finances to also control their territories in Africa. Another point is that these colonial masters, what led to their decolonization is that there was this, I can say, a sense of belonging, especially after World War II. After World War II, those soldiers who went to fight on the side of Britain in Europe, when they came back, they had a greater sense of nationalism and also a greater sense in participating in governance system. So the soldiers gained a sense of nationalism after World War II, and also Europeans were affected financially after World War II which affected also their way of controlling African territories. Number 3 is that we can talk of the educated elites. These educated elites also who had acquired the education from the European system had a great sense to participate in governance system and also to independence movements and processes. So these educated elites who had acquired education from Europe had a greater sense of participating in governance system, and apart from governance system, they also wanted to participate in independence processes. Another important point we have discussed about is Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism was an organization that brought together all people of African origin. Pan-Africanism was determined to ensure that Africa was independent and African continent was free from colonization. Another point is that the attitude. Now the attitude of European change, whereby they started focusing, the attitude of European change, whereby they started focusing on democracy and liberty, and they realized that it was important for Africans to be independent. Another point is that African leaders were inspired by countries such as India, and also India, which gained independence in 1947. African countries were also inspired by countries such as India, which gained independence in 1947. Basically, India gaining independence, Ghana gaining independence in 1947 was very inspirational to African leaders, and that's why they worked so hard to ensure that we gained independence. Another important point is that the emergence of what do we call the movements, the anti-colonial movements, the emergence of anti-colonial movements such as Mau Mau. This contributed much in the struggle for independence. The Mau Mau, the emergence of anti-colonial movements such as the Mau Mau contributed to the emergence of to the end of colonialism, because these movements were determined to end the colonialism. These movements were determined to ensure that Africans were independent and they were no longer dependent on Europeans. Another important point is that there were African leaders who are ready to participate in the process of ending colonialism. We had African leaders who were ready to participate in the process of ending colonialism and enhancing independence. There were African leaders who were ready to participate in the process of ending colonialism. Such leaders are Kwame Nkrumah. You can mention Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and others. Yes, up to there, any question? Any question, class? Yes, Marisela. Marisela? Yes, class. Any question concerning this title? So maybe you can write down this question. Write down this question. With relevant illustration, discuss factors that led to the coming of Europeans in Africa, With relevant illustration. With relevant illustration, discuss factors that led to the coming of Europeans in Africa. With relevant illustration, discuss factors that led to the coming of Europeans in Africa. Discuss also factors that led to decolonization. Discuss factors that led to decolonization of African continent. Discuss factors that led to decolonization of African continent. Factors that led to decolonization. Discuss factors that led to decolonization of African continent. Another point, not point, but question. The legacy of colonial powers can never be overlooked. The legacy of colonial powers can never be overlooked. The legacies of colonial power can never be overlooked, especially in this colonial period. With relevant illustration, discuss the legacies of colonial power can never be overlooked, especially in this contemporary period. With relevant illustration, discuss the legacy of colonial power cannot be overlooked. The legacy of colonial power cannot be overlooked, especially in this contemporary period. With relevant illustration, discuss. So up to there, I want you to revise those questions, as you prepare for examinations. So in our next class, we shall focus on, let me see.
Will you please pardon the question?
Maybe you can request your friends, because I was just mentioning from offhand.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sure someone has written class rep. Kindly share the questions with your colleagues, kindly. So I want you to look at this. I want you to look at, in our next discussion, we shall look at why Africans have failed to learn from colonialism. I want us to look at why Africans have failed to learn from colonialism. Why Africans have failed, we need to understand why Africans have failed to learn from colonialism. So in our next discussion, we will look at the reason why Africans have failed to learn from colonialism. Oh, you need cut? So let me give you a cut. But can you allow me to type the cut? Then it's only that Nani has not reminded me, your class rep. But class rep, tomorrow morning remind me, or today evening, so that I can share a Word document of your cut to your colleagues kindly. Otherwise, in our next class, we shall focus on whether Africans have learned or not. And I expect to listen to your views regarding that. Otherwise, have a good day and enjoy your day. We shall meet next week. Ochieng, you want to say something?
Ashe.
Okay, so we can look at Africans have whether Africans have learned from colonialism, and we shall also focus on important aspects regarding failed states in Africa, and we shall have a detailed conversation regarding Somali. Otherwise, you have raised your hand. Anyone who wants to speak, just speak. Pauline, Cynthia, Trina. Okay, if there is no any other comment or question, have a good day. Bye.
Same to you.
See you.
I have a question.
Hello.
Same
Hello.
to you. Wewe.
Kidogo. Acha siasa. Zungumza bwana tukusikie.
Any question?
Sasa Africans, I need everybody to stop